So we are going live with Gabriel Keczan, and I'm super excited to speak with you today. And we met kind of through a synchronistic circle. I think you're in Elizabeth Bass's book writing program.
Yeah.
Cool. So she's a good old friend of mine. So you're probably in it with Shamanama, and I think Stasia is the one who referred you to me. So now you know all my friends.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. So thanks for being on here. We're going to go deep into what is a vision quest, how it heals the modern man and his relationship to nature, the land, possibly even how he treats women and can heal society at large. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks so much for having me. Enjoying the connections and the synchronicity already. Just feels like a lot of grace.
Yeah. So I'm super excited to introduce you to my network. You're a men's coach, a somatic facilitator. I'm guessing you said an art therapist. So maybe you can just kind of speak into that a little bit, like all the hats that you wear.
Well, I'm trained as a somatic counselor and also as an art therapist. So those are some of my disciplines, and I've immersed myself in men's work in the last number of years and specialize in that area. So that's where I'm leading now in coaching men, but also bringing my healing tools into the coaching practice. So it's healing and coaching and essentially transformation facilitation.
Yeah. So if you're just chiming in here, give us a little a little what's up. Let us know where you're chiming in from. Gabriel's from BC, Canada. And later in the interview, we're going to talk about his upcoming event, which is a Vision Fast event in BC. And it's going to be beautiful and amazing. But first, I want to talk about what is heart-based leadership to you and why is it important?
Well, I think it's so important because we're in a crisis of leadership in so many ways in our world. And I think especially what I see in men is a lot of disorientation because, the dominant narrative, the dominant media landscape is saturated with so much really abuse of power and unhealthy expressions of leadership. That just is ready for change. And so coming down into the heart is that's that longest journey in the universe, right? From the mind to the heart, that few inches down, but it's a game changer because the heart is also the doorway to the soul and the descent into the self and the deeper self. And so dropping into that place actually requires whole new ways and paradigms of relating, different ways of doing business, and different ways of showing up. Essential for where we're at right now in these transition times to be leading from that soul-centered place. And for me, that soul-centered place comes also from earth-based, earth-honoring traditions. And that's, I guess, part of what brings me here today to talk about the Vision Fast and the importance of the land and connecting with that. And then leading with that vision in mind. I mean, principles of permaculture come to mind, right? How do we reconcile where we've come from and where we need to go if we're going to make the major changes our world needs? And so I guess that's the leading edge of heart-centered leadership is a vision that's connected to the here and now, what's real, and doing that with compassion and interest, not just in, one outcome, but the multi-layered sort of story of where we are. And so, that's a very different, much slower process of leadership. It's not like, all right, let's go, we're going. It's like, actually, we need to go about this with a whole different sense of what power is, and then show up in a serving capacity to this unwritten vision.
Yeah, and it sounds more holistic, and you have to keep in mind, how is this decision and action going to affect the whole? Not just how is it going to affect me? How is it going to affect my company? How is it going to affect the bottom line? Because so many decisions of CEOs are for their shareholders. And it's just the CEOs don't even like the decisions they're making. They're just like, well, gotta please the shareholders. So gotta meet this bottom line. And I'm like, so that helps what, 2 or 3 people, and then, deteriorates the integrity of the company or the employees or the planet most of the times. So we're not really making decisions based on holism. Like, how is this actually affecting the ecosystem?
Yeah, and I would add too, something about the wildness of creativity is coming in and down. One discovers who one is more clearly, and then creativity is messy, but it's what the world needs more than anything is people to come alive on their creative gifts and give those gifts. And those are game-changing ways of approaching what power is and how to serve in terms of leading with those gifts. Yeah,
Beautiful.
it's expansive.
Yeah. So I just want to just check in real quick. Did you hit your little share button so you have it live on your network?
Let me double check. I think I did. And
cool.
yeah, I see that it's on my page. Wait, yeah, so we're rolling on many
great.
frequencies here.
Yay. Awesome. So, of course, I just messed that up. Okay, cool. So you keep mentioning power and kind of like the right use of power. And so I'm wondering if you can speak into what you mean by that a little more.
Yeah, I think the way I orient as a coach and as a therapist is very body centered. So a lot of the times if I'm going to respond, I'm thinking where that lives in the body, and the place of power for me is the solar plexus, which on a collective level is so collectively wounded, in part because of our history and the complexities of it, but also because of an education system that teaches us to shrink and be small and obey, and isn't essentially designed for the liberation of the human being with their natural gifts and powers intact. So part of what my work is to shift that definition of what power is, that it's not this limited and myopic vision of materialistic power, but it's a wider expanse with other centers of intelligence that are living in the body in some ways, but also on the land and in connection and in relationship. So shifting to a relational sense of power and mutuality in mutual empowerment, and breaking the narrative, of the rugged individual and the competitiveness, because we need competition. It's healthy. And on another level, it has to fit into this overall cooperative design that is mutually empowering. So I don't know. That's what comes to mind, And I think power is something that needs to be interrogated, and it needs to be celebrated, but with this awakeness.
Like discernment comes to mind. Yeah. So it's kind of pointing towards this dominator paradigm, right? Which is like the aggressor or power over. And we just see that paradigm, in politics and just pretty much everywhere in the world. And it's a misuse of power, and it's not coming from this embodied holistic power and paradigm. And so I'm wondering, I'm kind of pointing towards that a lot of men no longer go through initiations, and they're living in kind of that infant narcissism or high chair tyrant kind of archetype, right? Is they haven't had a proper initiation from boyhood to manhood, and then we're just seeing the worst attributes of a testosterone induced brain not fully mature to its fullest capacity, like a loving, heart-centered man with the capacity to be a warrior, with the capacity to fight and kill, but using that capacity with discernment. And so I'm just wanting you to speak into what is the importance of a male-bodied person going through an initiation.
Um, this is just so essential to look at this, and this is something I've been passionate about for a number of years before I got into leading in men's work. I'm also a co-founder of a rites of passage restoration foundation called Sacred Pathways Foundation. And what we do is work with youth, and we bring them out to the bush, and then we create those experiences as a circle of men to honor the boys, what they're going through, and honor their journey towards manhood, which is really the missing piece in the culture, is to do that in a way that is conscious and awake and heart-centered. And it's the missing piece. I see also so much in men's work is so many of us enter that fray of coming to a men's group actually looking for something that we all missed. And that is that rite of passage from boyhood to manhood that keeps us thrashing around in our adolescent stuff and uncompleted stages of our own evolution. And that's the beautiful thing about men's work and men supporting each other, is that we can provide those blessings in the context of the work we do. And essentially the missing blessing of the village fathers to say, you're a man and there's a lot of responsibility to that, and thank you and bless you. And that blessing to be taken in on a somatic level, deeply into the body and into the soul and into the psyche, on all these levels, the absence of that blessing is the reason we have such a messed up world with all these men leading a military industrial complex and a political system that's just wreaking havoc on human beings and on the planet.
Yeah, police brutality and systemic racism, just this perpetrator consciousness is just running rampant. Like, police are just brutalizing unarmed, innocent men and women, and particularly Black men and women. And it's just the ugliest part of this. It's so brutal and terrifying. And I loved what you said of like honoring the journey of boyhood to manhood. And that might not be honored these days. So yeah, if you have a question for Gabriel, if you're feeling this, give us a little like or love. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And so I would love to know a little bit more about your personal story, and maybe what was that event for you where you felt that transition from boyhood to manhood, or if it was later in life, or if you had to find it and define it for yourself.
Great question. I mean, where to enter such a question?
Yeah.
That takes me back.
Tell me about your whole life.
20 some odd years of all these experiences. But when that rite of passage, that initiation isn't done consciously, it comes about unconsciously through the shadow initiations of uninitiated culture. So, I mean, for me, that looked like playing hockey in Canada as a competitive hockey player as a youth, just seeing so much of that misuse of power, and in the absence of initiatory elders, we initiated each other in all these ways that were actually humiliating and were actually shadow initiations. So, you know, coming back as a man later, looking back on that time going, oh, okay, that's what that was about. And, and I can laugh, but at the same time, it's a deep tragedy that there's this wound. Yeah, and so there's a lot of work to do in reclaiming I love the name of this podcast, The Kings of the New Earth, that divine quality of sacred masculine that is actually also in touch with that warrior spirit, and it's also aligned with that fierce protector role and you know, reconstituting those powers. So Yeah, I mean, my story also goes through my own psychotic episode at age 18. I was hospitalized um, for what they called the psychotic episode, but what I now recognize as a form of spiritual emergence in the absence of that which I needed. And then that set me on a path of being a seeker, and eventually led me into a Sundance community and finding some of that through making relations with the indigenous lifeways of this continent, and the grace that allowed me to participate in some vision fasts and some ceremony with the elders, with the drums, and seeing those men. There was something that happened that was actually beyond words when I sat in a sweat with a whole number of men. And there's something that happens in the transmission between men and boys that's invisible. But I'm sitting inside this sweat, and the steam is happening, and the songs are happening, and there's just nothing but prayer happening all around me. And I took that in on the level of my bones. And that was a huge transition and transmission for me to recognize what was missing of that blessing of fathers as a younger man with older men in a ceremonial space. And I think that's what all sorts of men's work is reaching for, is how do we repair that missing piece? And so that's why, you know, I talk about bone memory in my practice, and what is in there is actually grandfather stuff. That's the missing link of that father's blessing, and that goes back generations, and that has been ruptured because of our history and our dislocations. And how do we repair that? And I mean, that's another thing I do, is I facilitate a father reconciliation course, which takes that trouble I just named into heart, and creates a real foundation for healing that, and then thereby empowering men to step into their gifts, step into their creativity, because that's the missing blessing, and that's what it's there for. It's meant to awaken that man's purpose in the world.
Yeah. So that brings us, there's just so much in there that I could go into, but I know we kind of have like topics we really want to cover. But so you're speaking into a man's purpose. And from my understanding, and from what I teach in men's sexuality coaching, is their purpose is really a primary pillar, or if not the primary pillar in their life. And if they're not really deeply anchored in that, it really affects how it shows up in every area of their life, right? Like they're not fully embodying themselves. They're not fully stepping up. They're not fully owning that king archetype. There might be shadow pieces they're hiding away from. They're not claiming like the fullness of their life and their capacity and sacred service and their gift and like what they're here to truly give. So I'd love for you to go into that process a little bit more, and also how this vision fast could assist a man, not only in that initiatory process, but also in finding their deeper purpose and gift in the world.
Thank you for that question. One way I like to look at it is that purpose alignment, you know, I agree, is the center of what gives a man his mission in life. And that mission has momentum, and that mission has direction, which is actually a quality of the masculine, is the directive force. So that missing piece of purpose alignment that so many of our education systems fail on.
They teach you to be a human doing and not a human being.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, really good at achieving and getting things done, and the to-do list and the check and the whatever. And so guys spend probably up until their 50s building this career, and then at some point they kind of wake up and go, what was I doing my whole life? Like, what did I dedicate my whole life to?
Yeah, and it's that question of like, who am I? That simple question at the heart of any rite of passage process is, who am I, and what am I here for, and who's with me? And you know, it's it's elemental, but it's something you can revisit time and time again. So yeah, purpose work, I mean, that's also my focus as a coach with men, is looking at purpose and coming alive on purpose, because purpose is also a terrifying force, because it's what's gonna cook a man out of his comfort level and cook him out of his mediocrity and bring him into his own hero's journey. And purpose is a slippery thing. It's something that's shifting and changing all the time, but at the same time, it's something that never changes because it's who you are. And it's your gift, and it's your unique essence and signature as a being, as an infinite being. So it takes containment and it takes release, both, to enter this process of cooking down the individual into that purpose gift and then launching into that momentum of the journey. And in any fairy tale that you know of, where there is kings or queens and there's a hero or heroine, that journey of that lead actor moving in and out of the realm of the sovereign, of the king or queen, it always involves life or death conditions. It's always like, either you do this or you're dead.
Yeah.
And so it actually requires that kind of awakeness. And that's why I named my program Alive on Purpose, because you have to want to be alive, because there's a counter energy that causes the shrinkage of the individual from their creativity and from their gifts.
There's
and
like
that
an inherent atrophy that we're always fighting against.
Yeah, and some people have called that the predator. And that's one of the ways I put it into language too, is to name it the predator, because then we can clearly see the fight. And it can be the fight of your life to actually enact your creativity, but perhaps that's what you're here for. Perhaps that's it. And it requires multiple levels of support, because asking for help is a power move.
Asking for help is a power move.
Yeah,
But
and I mean, in any,
don't believe that though.
No, and I mean, that's part of our shame. And men and women experience shame differently. I'm sure you're quite well versed in that in your own work and in this field. Men are taught to be strong, don't be weak, don't ask for help. Exactly. Those are almost, because then you're weak. I mean, these are all ways that we cleave off that part of ourselves that's connected to the feminine, that's connected to the intuitive, and that's connected to nature and the earth, and the more than human realm. And it's a tragedy that we shrink ourselves that small, because that's what that predatory energy is meant to do, is to shrink us into obedience, and to actually have the courage to expand and to claim space and to claim agency in a time also where men are getting such mixed messages, also because many of us are awake to how corrupt it is to see the examples of men and manhood in the world so flawed and so wounded. So we have to tend our own wounds and at the same time moving forward. So there's a movement in and down, and then there's a movement forward at the same time in that reclamation. And yeah, it is a power move, asking for help.
Yeah. So we talked about shame, and kind of the primary things that come up for men is just like, don't be weak, don't ask for help, those types of things. But would you say that's the primary wound of the men that you work with, or do you see another common pattern?
Well, another pattern, I mean, there's other shame gremlins, like Brene Brown likes to talk about the who do you think you are as a gremlin, a shame gremlin, and then the other one being not enough. The not enough gremlin affects a lot of us.
Yeah.
And I'll include myself in that too. I mean, just a couple of days ago, I fell into a not enough shame pit, and I was like being devoured by that particular gremlin.
Yeah.
And in so many, like not enough money, not enough time, not enough sex, not enough power, not whatever it is, not enough is this part of that predatory energy. And yeah, so the other thing that happens is collapse, because also the power that men can have has also been shamed by the critique of men, and embracing feminism and saying, oh yeah, this is a messed up world. And now I can see why, from this, trying to embrace this feminist perspective, but how do I do that without slaying myself, without falling on my own sword? And so the sword is a symbol I like to use for, obviously it's a phallic symbol, but it's also a symbol of power. And many men are afraid to pick up their own sword, and they're afraid of their own power.
Right.
And that's something that's unique, I think, about this work is coaching men into empowerment. You can almost be like, oh, well, why would men need power? They're the problem. And it's like, actually, when men are descended into their gift and their creativity, we need those men to pick up their sword more than ever, because their sword is also their voice. And that's that force of leadership that you started this conversation on, is that soul-centered voice of, this is what I'm here for, and this is what I'm going to create, even if it seems impossible. Right. This is why I'm here.
We need, I don't know if it's going to be PC or not, but we need the white wounded man to start assimilating these principles so that he can lead from a heart consciousness, so he can lead from a deeper heart's purpose, so he can be part of the solution and not just be the perpetrator or the hiding feminist, like I'm just going to shrink and hide and not use my power, my strength, or my voice. It's like we do need a balance to happen within this demographic that, does have wounds. They have privilege, certainly, right? They have a lot of privilege, but they're also extremely wounded. And it's the cause, like I'm going to keep speaking into this in later interviews, but it's kind of like, well, if we're so mad at it, like we're so mad at patriarchy and we're so mad at the white man, if that's what we're so mad at, that must have the deepest wound that we also need to address individually and collectively. Like there must be something so deep in that perpetrator consciousness that we can't just keep finger pointing and blaming and expect things to change.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, because that blame is part of that shame construct. The way I see shame too is it's a freezing force, and it freezes the individual and it breeds in silence and it creates a frozenness. So somatically, taking that in on my midline, which is another metaphor for the sword, right? The Sushumna in lots of yogic traditions, and this embodiment placement is where all of my power centers line up. So if I'm, shamed out of my agency, then it's actually a loss for the whole and all of us. Because we're all in this together, and yeah, and it's sad, and there's a heck of a lot of grieving that needs to happen. Sometimes perhaps the purpose is to grieve and to open to the feeling body and to all that has been repressed there, not only in this lifetime, but maybe multi-generationally, maybe ancestral grief inherited that needs to be wept and moved now, so that we can find those clear visions that come after tears. And that's, I think you also asked about how does this tie into the vision fast?
Yeah, I love that you're using grief as a portal into purpose.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I was grieving a loss of a marriage when I decided to go and do 4 years worth of vision fasting. So it was grief that brought me to that place. It was grief that brought me to my knees. And in the Lakota tradition, the vision quest is actually called the Hamblicha, which means crying for a dream, where the word dream is actually synonymous with life. So it's when a person becomes so in pain or crisis that they descend and into grief and say, ask for help. How do I be in my life? Show me my life. And so that's part of that ask for a vision. I mean, it's asking for guidance and self-knowledge in that isolation time. So, and essentially what it is a practice of land-based initiation using solo time on the land, fasting for a 4-day period, 4 days, 4 nights on the land with a supportive base camp and some ceremonial preparations and follow-up integrations that help anchor the experience and integrate the experience. But in my life, there was nothing more healing and transformative than coming into that commitment to that solo time, empty, removed from worldly connection to kind of go, oh, who am I and why have my decisions led me to this place? And what do I do next? How do I untie the contracts that have led me here that are harming me? And how do I step into my soul contract of who I'm meant to be and the gifts I'm meant to give? So that's also the way this Vision Fest functions in terms of culture repair, is offering a space for men to come together and be held by a strong circle of men and do that heroic thing, which is go out there and be brave and sit empty on the land under the sky, and in a way be reborn, because initiation is always about a sort of death and rebirth.
Yeah.
And so going out on the land, the new parents become the earth mother and the sky father. And it is between those two aspects that the man reorients to his responsibilities as a man and can reconstitute his purpose and his personal healing, rather than from that boyhood place of, you know, the mommy issues or the daddy issues, or I didn't get my blessing I needed, or whatever it is, the adolescent stuff, the misuse of power that is murky in our adolescent culture. It can all come together in that time to get, in a way, purified and reset. There's nothing better of a pattern interrupt that I know of than taking that time for that fast. So yeah, I have incredible reverence for the land and for the people who preserved this tradition that as it came into my life, which is the Sundance, the Lakota Sundance, that Leonard Crow actually brought up to Western Canada, so-called Western Canada. And in honoring the land and its power in this transformative work, I also honor the people whose land I'm on. And in my region, we call them the Sinaiaks people. And I always like to acknowledge them because it's their ancestral homelands on whose ground, you know, me as a Canadian gets to make home. And there, you know, even in that, there's a lot of healing that still needs to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So just so people have a little bit more of a reference, is you're actually going to be leading a group through this vision fasting in July. I think you said July 16th. And so just kind of go into a little bit more of what they could expect in this experience. And a little bit more of like, what is a vision fast? What is a vision quest? You kind of were hinting at elements, but I'm wondering if you can just go a little bit deeper into that.
Okay, well, essentially the gathering point is in the mountains, about an hour north of where I live in Nelson, BC, at a remote wilderness location up a mountain, and some of the most beautiful watersheds and the most powerful mountain ranges that I know of in this inland temperate rainforest. So that's the scene. And essentially we gather, and for the first few days, it's a week-long retreat. The first few days are about gathering and building container and sharing some of that preparation time on the land and forming a village, forming a sort of an instant brotherhood village. And really honoring those who are stepping forward to do this in a big way, and really just giving them space to say why they're there and own their own journey. And then we also share some teachings around how to prepare for that solo time on the land. And we create the container of actually that circle of strength of men supporting one another, and the blessings of that space of brotherhood and kinship. And then those who are going to fast will go out and be in a solo place, and they'll be guided there and supported there and checked on there. And so essentially they're going to be in a sit spot on the mountain, and they'll have a tarp and some sleeping gear, but that's it, just some basic stuff, and then some ceremonial orientation on their spot that is part of the protection of that placement, and then just being there and being in ceremony. And I like to say that it's also a self-generating ceremony. Whatever traditions or prayers or meditations or ways that people have, those are yours. And this ceremony is a self-initiating process. So it's actually your ceremony. And the team that I'm part of that is bringing this offer up is just there to hold a process and to support you to do your work. Mm-hmm. And then welcome you back essentially as a hero for being this courageous and doing this deep dive into yourself and your healing. So yeah, that's the process. And then as we bring the men back in from their solo time, we listen to them, we hear from them about what they want to share. And we also have, a team of healers on hand that bring a weave of different modalities to help the men integrate, come back down to earth, essentially, and break fast and start again, eating fruits and slowly integrate back into their bodies, because it's a big shift to go into this place of responsibility for one's life and go, oh, now I know what I need to change. And so there needs to be a lot of support and a lot of warmth and brotherhood, and so that's part of the offer is rebuilding men and rebuilding culture that's connected with the land.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I know from my own experience just going into meditation retreat and being silent for 3 to 5 or longer days, you reach a certain sensitivity in your being, and it's kind of the outside, this world, this digital world, our work world doesn't make sense anymore. Like cars don't make sense, technology doesn't make sense, most of society doesn't make sense, because when you return to your natural inherent state with nature and with your own being, you become so quiet and so distilled, and it's almost like everything becomes permeable, like, or translucent, like you can kind of see through everything and feel through everything, and everything is very intense. And I'm sure people who drink ayahuasca, there's this period afterwards where you're like, oh my God. And I've had a few friends not integrate well after a journey like that. One even committed suicide, not having a framework to re-enter this society that is so vastly different from what we're shown is possible on the other side, or the spirit realms that we touch, or the ecstasy, or the connection, or the euphoria, and they don't have this integration process. And it's so important to have that integration and bringing someone back down into their bodies in a gentle way, but also helping them integrate what they found and what they discovered, so they're not just returning back to their life, and then once the experience fades out, they're just like, all right, I'm gonna get back on my computer and just do the thing, like go back to exactly the way things are, right? I would think the point would be go back and spearhead a new life, like spearhead a new consciousness, a new way of doing things. Yeah.
That's it. And thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry to hear about that friend.
Me too. It was very shocking. I mean, most suicides obviously are very shocking, but I think it's difficult to know how much someone is actually suffering when they don't tell you.
Yeah.
And so that was one of those beings, like I just didn't even know he was having a hard time. And I didn't know he was isolated, and he got back into alcoholism and probably some other things. Like I just didn't know that there was just this huge, probably awakening experience, and this huge like being blown open, and we're like, yay, I mean, I would assume his experience was opening, and then kind of come back to this world that doesn't fit in with these new paradigms that were shown.
Mm, yeah, and there's something of that quality of life and death, and that story of that loss of life, you know, being an example of that, as the power of doing this reclamation work, this spirit-based work, and the importance of containment and follow-up and integration and being really gentle. Uh, One of the ways that I um, know that the vision fast or the vision quest is held is that those people coming back from that sacred time on the mountain are like newborn babies.
Yeah.
Because it's that subtle, that level of transformation. So we welcome them back with that level of subtlety and sensitivity,
Mm-hmm.
as if they're a newborn baby, and we hold them with that reverence, and and then gradually bringing them back
Mm-hmm.
into that place we talked about earlier of being the man who knows who he is and he has his purpose. And I mean that's part of, I think, what we need men in terms of leadership to have the power to oscillate between, is the sensitivity to be holding that new life and
Mm-hmm.
that tenderness, but also to have the fierceness to be able to protect life when needed, and to stand up and stand ground. Um, I love what you said too about spearheading a new life coming out of ceremony, because that to me is that purpose stuff, because it creates a kind of tip of the spear of, oh, this is how I'm pointing into the world with my purpose. So yeah, just
Mm-hmm.
reverence for what you shared.
Yeah, and I feel like after a period of time goes by, like we're really inspired after an opening experience, and then if we don't assimilate and integrate properly, that experience can kind of just fade, and then the spear becomes dull, and then we
Yeah.
just even forget that there was a spear. We're just like, well, I don't know, I had a vision, but life starts happening. So I'm wondering if you have any kind of tools or ideas of how men, just in general, or women, um, can start to apply some of their visions in a like a grounded way.
Um, Practice, I think,
Yeah.
but also having multiple layers of support. Like I had a mentor recently at some point tell me, what you're doing and what you're here for, you need multiple levels and layers of support to be able to fulfill. You need emotional support, you need unconditional support and encouragement, you need physical support, you need, you need your inspiration, and you need to feed that. Um, yeah, and it's a discipline to come into practice of working with that power of creativity, because it's a wild force. And the dominant culture has this narrative of what some people call it, like the church of rock and roll. People who are wildly out there, like the Jimi Hendrix or the Janis Joplin and the Elvis Presley, they get burnt out, like the Kurt Cobains. That was my generation in the 90s, of like, hey, there's this artist who's speaking to a generation of their angst, and he can't contain the energy and power that is vested in him by being that cultural leader. So asking for help is essential to how to move with integrity and work multidimensionally with integrating. Um, yeah, so I mean, that's where, I come from a background in therapy and somatics and creativity, and then leading into coaching and men's work,
Yeah.
which is the forward stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a lot of paradoxes to it. And yeah.
Yeah, I love that you said multiple levels or layers of support, because we all had unmet needs as children, and that's the time when we were like, I thought I had unconditional love and unconditional support, and And I still don't know if that's actually possible within just like a human to human relationship. Like there's still going to be a little bit of a flop, but you can have a mentor who is rooting for you, who is holding a container for you, who is cheering you on, who is maybe a little further along on the journey. And then that emotional support that you said, and probably just like practical, like just what are the steps? And are you actually doing the first step? Are you actually taking action? Right. And because if we're just staying in that emotional, ambiguous layer, it's like, it doesn't actually get actualized in and grounded. So you were going to share a little book, or you picked it up for some reason, or
We were talking about the third stage of the rite of passage, initiation, and this is Martin Shaw. I just love his writing, and I picked him up because he's a guide, a wilderness guide, and he says that the biggest thing missing for those of us in the modern context, trying to reclaim these initiations, is the third stage, which is integration. Mm-hmm. Because we can easily go off and have our weekend warrior experience or our weekend workshop of heart opening, transformation, and then we get back to the grind on Monday morning, and then how do we integrate that? And so that's where the longer term vision of culture change comes in, and what I see and I get so excited about is a lot of men stepping into togetherness and saying, we got to heal our wounds as men. And the trick is that the wound never does actually get healed. It just gets tended to the place where it becomes manageable, and then it doesn't get in the way. Right. And so it's both. It's like, yes, we need to look at our wounds, and we can't get lost in them. We need to also gather up our strengths and bring our gold back. The journey from the underworld back into the daylit world usually involves a return gift. And that's the thing that gets lost is, okay, now what are you bringing back from that? How can we sustain that gift so it becomes a force for good and transformation and regeneration in the world? And when I'm talking about that gift, I'm also talking about the self, right? It's both and. It's who am I now? Yeah, so I don't know if that answered your question, but I picked up Martin Shaw.
I love it. Yeah, it did. I love that you're saying like bringing back the gold, bringing back the gift. And that's both maybe a tangible thing. There's something that you're going to create, but also it's your truest, deepest self. It's your truest essence. It's like, I can kind of describe it as radiance. Like, it's just this inner glow that you're like, okay, I'm ready to share this in a more open way. And then we do this work to remove the layers of conditioning, and what better way to do that in nature, right? Because nature doesn't have doesn't condition us in the way that society does, or humans do. And so it's an amazing way to decondition and come back to the naked self and come back to the gift and the soul essence of who you are. And I've actually even heard processes like that used for people who are suicidal, is to go back into nature. It's like, you can't have all of these problems, these mental problems, and even some emotional problems when you spend that amount of time in nature, or like go on a 9-hour hike. Like your consciousness is going to change drastically. Yeah. Cool. So you were talking about this culture shift, and that brings me to my last question, which is, what is your vision for the new earth? What does that look like for you?
Well, I see a vision, at least in my own sphere and realm, because I'm a dad too. I have 2 boys and 2 bonus daughters. And when I reflect on my own boyhood and my own initiations, shadow initiations and chosen ones, mm-hmm. I see so much work to do still. And so, working with men in an empowering context as a coach is part of that. And another part of that vision is for us as men to get together and create spaces to honor the youth, and to create those spaces where the boys who are looking for better examples of how to be men can actually be held by a village. And so that's why, I mean, I founded that Sacred Pathways Foundation to recreate those spaces within the village for the blessings of that transition and restore that. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It can start simple. It can start with just, you know, creating a space, taking a camp, bringing fathers and sons together. And the tricky thing is that those of us who didn't have that blessing have a wound there that's tender. And so, especially the dads who may not have gone through something like that, to be able to then turn around and give that to their son, they need to be that held, because they're changing a pattern of that missing piece by trying to recreate it, and then holding their own wound as they're from their own adolescent journey, and then giving something better to their own sons, which is essentially a village of village fathers and men, with diversity, all with different powers and gifts. And, you know, that's essential for boys to see, oh, okay, that's my dad. And also, or, you know, those are the mentors who are the men in my life, and they're all different. And yet they're all here for the same reason, which is to help us grow up and become men. And so I guess that's part of that vision is, you know, on the one hand, helping the men sharpen their spear tip around why they're here and their purpose leading into the world. And in another way, creating these spaces, these reclaimed spaces for youth to be celebrated and blessed, so that we don't have so many problems, because we have more young men getting that missing blessing and saying yes to the gift of their life, and yeah, recreating culture in that way.
Beautiful. So yeah, just want to speak into that because one of the primary wounds of young men and boys is to not feel their emotions, and certainly don't express them. And there's not really many safe places for them to express their emotions. So they have to bottle it up for so long. And that's why the suicide rate for men is like 4 or 5 times greater than women, is because they don't have a safe space to express themselves. So you're literally changing the generational wound from father to son. And then this new generation of like, okay, you're in a sacred circle, you're held by the village, your voices are valid, you're giving them a space to speak, right? So you're de-wound. It's almost like the de-wounding. Like, this is the deep work in society that we need to do. So we're not creating those wounded perpetrators. We're not creating the racist bigots. We're not creating the high chair narcissistic president, you know, people, politicians or whatever, because they never had that safe space. They never had that tribal support that I think, you know, our primal brains grew up on, right? Like, we grew up a little bit more, I like to think, according to Sex at Dawn, we grew up that way.
Great book.
Yeah, it's a great book. So, you know, I didn't check all of his sources, but I like to think it's all true, that we lived in these beautiful tribal societies, mostly matriarchal, but of course, matriarchy just meant equality. It's not even the opposite of patriarchy. It was just like, we're all sharing, we're all in this tribal kind of mind together. And so we lost a lot of that. And so I love that I can just see the ripple effect that has on society. Like, it creates such a huge, from father to son, and then the son, you know, growing up and having a safe space. It's just such beautiful work. Yeah. So where can people find you?
Well, my website is just myname.com, so gabrielkeczan.com. And I will add that there are still spaces in the Men's Vision Fast. So if there's any man who feels called and is in that point of their life, he's, you know, get in touch with me. It starts July 16th to 23rd. And also on my website, you can find a free ebook for men that's called Alive on Purpose. And it's a guidebook for getting clear on your purpose and working with your creativity, and overcoming, unclenching from fear, so that you can claim your inner king.
Is that the guidebook that I read?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
thank you
that's
for that.
what connected us, and it's so brilliant. It's so well thought out. There's just it just really displays your brilliance as a teacher and a coach and a man who's really been through this, like really gone through your own darkness, your own grief processes, your own shadow integration, and you're just doing such beautiful work in the world. So I'm happy to have this conversation with you. So any closing thoughts?
Um, I'm just grateful, Lauren. Thank you so much for having me. And also just honor the work you're doing with men and working with the sexuality. And that's a huge a part of it because that
Mhm.
connects with our creativity. So also just thank you for your work.
Thank you. Beautiful. So this is Lauren Searles, in case you didn't know, and my website is loveangelcoaching.com, and we're both available on Facebook. So if you want to reach out to Gabriel, just message him directly if that's easier for you, and I'm sure he would be happy to support you. So thank you so much. And then we didn't get a lot of comments, but there were definitely some viewers. But if you guys have comments that come in later, we'll certainly answer any questions. So awesome. Well, have a beautiful rest of your day. Thank you so much for coming on.